Chapter 10. Exercise 1. Discussions of corporate governance still pay much attention to the structure, role, and responsibilities of the board of directors. Most boards contain a mixture of insiders and outsiders. Insiders are people who are employed or have been employed by the corporation or its subsidiaries. The CEO of a corporation, for example, is often a member of its board of directors. Outsiders are more independent of the corporation. The insiders provide specific insight into the relevant corporation. They have specialized information and experience of the corporation precisely because of their close links to it. The outsiders provide a more objective perspective and a more neutral oversight. They can prevent groupthink and collusion among the insiders, thereby protecting the interests of the shareholders. Indeed, most accounts of corporate governance emphasize the importance of the board having a majority of outsiders. Studies suggest that having a majority of outsiders on the board generally improves the performance of a corporation. Exercise 2. Although all human populations represent a single evolutionary lineage, there are some genetic differences between human populations. These differences are minor compared to the interpopulation differences observed in most other species. We are not subdivided into discrete groups and clusters, as most of our diversity displays gradual changes, including such traditional racial traits such as skin color. The few genetic changes that show a more discrete distribution have distributions that reflect local selective agents and not races. For example, sickle cell is found in high frequency in malarial regions and is not a disease of blacks, as it is in high frequency in many non-African populations that live in malarial regions. The vast majority of genetic diversity in humans exists between us as individuals, not members of a population, making each of us genetically unique. Exercise 3. Very huge expansions in irrigated cropland were achieved in parts of Central Asia during the 20th century during the period of the Soviet Union. The Karakum Canal, which diverts water from the Amu Darya westwards across southern Turkmenistan, was completed in 1986, after more than 30 years in construction. The canal is no less than 1,400 kilometers long, and the water it delivers has enabled crops to be grown on more than 7,000 square kilometers of land that would otherwise be too dry for cultivation. Sadly, however, Turkmenistan's irrigation systems are poorly designed and inefficient, resulting in large tracts of cropland facing problems of salinization and/or waterlogging. The loss of water from irrigation canals is also considerable. Most are not lined, so water seeps away, and evaporation rates in the arid climate are high. Consequently, more than one-third of the water diverted from the Amu Darya never reaches the fields. Exercise 4. No one likes the feeling that other people are waiting impatiently for a response. At the beginning of the day, faced with an overflowing inbox, an array of voicemail messages, and the list of next steps from your last meeting, it's tempting to clear the decks before starting your own work. When you're up to date, you tell yourself it will be easier to focus. The trouble with this approach is it means spending the best part of the day on other people's priorities. By the time you settle down to your own work, it could be mid-afternoon, when your energy dips and your brain slows. Oh well, maybe tomorrow will be better, you tell yourself. But tomorrow brings another pile of emails, phone messages, and to-do list items. If you carry on like this, you will spend most of your time responding to incoming demands and answering questions framed by other people, and you will never create anything truly worthwhile. Focusing on reactive work to deal with other people's priorities before starting your own work will make you unproductive. Exercise 5. Every comic moment is traumatic. The enjoyment that comedy offers is inseparable from the trauma associated with making conscious and unconscious connection. Comedy forces us to confront, for instance, the failings of those whom we suppose to embody flawless authority. This authority secures the ground of our existence. Though we can laugh at this ground trembling, it nonetheless also delivers a traumatic shock. Or comedy makes explicit the connection between the act of eating and the act of defecating, a connection that might make it harder to enjoy a hamburger. Those who hate all forms of comedy and retreat from every joker they see coming are in some sense right. They recognize the inseparability of the enjoyment that comedy provides from its traumatic impact. There is no comedy without a jolt that potentially shatters the ground of our everyday lives. Exercise 6. The response you make to someone's message does not have to be immediate. You can respond minutes, days, or even years later. For example, your second-grade teacher may have asked you to stop throwing rocks at a group of birds that were on the playground. Perhaps the teacher added that the birds were part of a family and were gathering food for their babies. She might also have indicated that birds feel pain just like people. Perhaps 20 years later, as you think about eating an animal, you remember those words from your teacher and decide to become a vegetarian. It is important to remember the power of your messages and to consider the ethical consequences of your communication actions, for whether or not you want to grant those consequences, you are changing people each time you exchange messages with them. Exercise 7. Hierarchy is probably the most common form of organizing the workplace. There aren't a lot of good alternatives to it, and companies need some say in managing workers, particularly as they scale. However, there are also a lot of downsides to hierarchy, and over the last decade, my collaborators and I have documented the many ways in which it can go wrong. Team members squabble over resources, engage in power struggles, and battle over rank. All of this harms performance. One of the burning questions in management research right now is, what are the best alternatives to hierarchy? But it's a complex picture. Hierarchy isn't always bad or harmful, and its effectiveness may depend on where and how it's implemented, and how the person at the top manages the hierarchy. For example, there is growing interest in remote work and virtual teams, and in that context, hierarchy works quite well. Exercise 8. When we look around at our dwellings at the end of our lives and survey all the commodities that we have accumulated, we often come to the insight that they amount to nothing but a heap of worthless junk. Like most insights that come as one approaches the end, this one is entirely misleading. The fact that the commodities were worthless junk from the beginning is what gave them their sublimity and what gave us enjoyment in accumulating them. No one values accumulating useful things, The collector, who is a derivation of the capitalist bent on total accumulation, always collects items with no use value, old stamps, empty beer cans, baseball trading cards, and so on. One doesn't collect useful items because there is no enjoyment attached to their accumulation. Though capitalism preaches self-interest, the enjoyment that it offers, the enjoyment of the sublime commodity, is an enjoyment that depends on the absence of self-interest. The idea that what we as collectors have accumulated is valueless at the end of our lives is completely false, since we get pleasure from the act of collecting it. Exercises 9 through 11. Gifts build fans and result in people sharing on social media and in person to their friends. A gift is often so unexpected that people can't help but feel compelled to talk about it. When Paul needed to go from his hotel at Sydney Olympic Park to the international airport for a flight to Los Angeles, he asked a hotel staffer to call a cab. About halfway through the 45-minute ride to the airport, Paul's driver turned to him and handed him a pen with the words, "Hi, Charlie," in all capital letters, and his telephone number on it. Paul smiled and said, "Hi, Charlie." At first, Paul thought he didn't really need a pen and was about to give it back. And then he started to think about that gift. The hotel called Charlie's cab over the other cabs in the area, so he was doing something right to get that work. But with ride-sharing companies, the traditional cab business was getting squeezed. How could an independent cab driver compete? The pen was an interesting way to stand out and be remembered. And then Charlie gave Paul another unexpected gift. When they were about a mile from the airport, Charlie did something Paul has never experienced before in hundreds of cab rides in cities all over the world. He turned the meter off at exactly $100. Paul and Charlie didn't set that as a fixed price, and Paul was willing to pay the full fare. He just turned off the meter. At the end of the ride, Paul tried to give Charlie a tip, but he refused. Paul had such a great experience and shared it on his blog. 5 months later, Paul was in Sydney again. This time, he didn't ask the hotel to call him a cab, and he didn't use a ride-sharing company. This time, when he was ready to go to the airport, he knew what to do. And when he got into his cab for the second time, he greeted his driver with, "Hi, Charlie," just as the free pen had prompted Paul to do.